And now we have wine and beer here at the Brothers of the Serpent podcast in the Tangent Cube with Marty. Part 3 of UFOs.
Yeah, because you don't have to do anything.
That's
So
right.
you can drink.
I can just like...
Normally, I'm the only guy that gets to drink in here.
Marty's doing all the work, so I'm just like, well, yeah, UFOs. So where are we going next? You said you told us a whole bunch of accounts.
Right, that was a lead up. We're going to shift gears now.
Okay.
So in UFOs Part 1, we discussed how the Bethel Memorial Institute's top secret Pinnacle memo written by Dr. Howard Cross, which aimed to withhold information from the CIA's 1952 UFO investigation panel headed by H.P. Robertson. We talked about the H.P. Robertson being in charge of the CIA's UFO research, but we didn't discuss why Robertson was selected by the CIA. Just like we learned that Howard Cross was selected as head of Air Force's Project Stork due to his prior clandestine involvement in UFO investigations at Bethel dating back to 1947. On January 6, 1944, Major General S.G. Henry officially established the Committee on Countermeasures Against German Secret Weapons, which investigated the Foo Fighter phenomenon. Later, that morphed into the Scientific Intelligence Advisory Section, and much to our surprise, the investigation was led by none other than H.P. Robertson. In 1945, H.P. Robertson was placed in the lead position of the first official Foo Fighter investigation, the Scientific Intelligence Advisory Section, which gave him complete access to all materials surrounding Foo Fighters and unconventional aircraft phenomena, including photographs, motion pictures, and he had access to some of the best engineers and scientific minds. Their expertise covered a wide variety of scientific backgrounds. At his disposal was the intelligence agencies, the scientific fields, the scientific teams, and he had access to captured enemy military personnel, scientists, and technology experts. And due to his ties in London, he was able to obtain information on the phenomenon gathered by the British Ministry of over the years. On February 11th, 1945, the Air Commodore Garrison sent a memorandum to headquarters, which officially acknowledged that 2 investigations of Foo Fighters were now initiated. One by Air Technical Intelligence to conduct first-hand interviews with crews, and the second investigation headed by H.P. Robertson. But there was yet another group of men looking into the phenomenon from Washington. According to the 415th Night Fighter Squadron's commanding officer, Major Augusper, the visitors showed up and bypassed him, immediately contacting Captain Ringwald. The Foo Fighters were technically Ringwald's concern since he was the unit's intelligence officer and interrogated the crews. Major Augusper knew that the Washington men were definitely there to investigate the Foo Fighters, and that secrecy surrounded the whole issue. According to Operations Officer Captain Charles Horn, the men from Washington were skeptical people. They did not believe that the crews were. They did not believe in what the crews were reporting, and thought the men were going nuts or needed a vacation and perhaps maybe to go home.
Yeah.
It was reported that the commanding officers of some of the night fighter units were forbade their intelligence officers to use the term Foo Fighter in their operational reports because the term sounded silly. They were not going to allow such nonsense forwarded up the chain of command. To ensure that this new mandate was followed, the squadron intelligence were instructed to inform the crews that they were observing jets or flares and not some kind of mystery object. This policy, if enforced, not only suppressed the facts, but it served to muddy the waters of an already murky subject.
Yeah.
So in a way, what is the term now? UAPs or
Right. Now we're finding what we're finding out here is that now there was a UFO investigation, what was essentially a UFO investigation, almost 10 years before Project Sign, or that's not well known.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the
terminology.
The terminology, because I can see how like a group of guys, maybe they're awesome soldiers or whatever, but still they're low ranking. They come up with some term to call these things, and of
based
course,
on a comic book.
Yeah, and they don't want that going up the chain of command. That makes sense. So it's like what they did, instead of coming up with UAPs or something, they came up with, call it flares or something else. Don't say it's unexplained or unknown, or which is bad for studying it. So it's like, at least now they've agreed on a term on the higher end.
Well, according to the other memo, just from the Night Fighter Squadron, there was 304 reports. That's just from the Night Fighter Squadron.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that were referring to Foo Fighters. So now we're throwing into the mix that some of them might not have been called Foo Fighters. So how many were actually seen?
Yeah. It's good to have a term that's agreed upon by the higher ups, is my point. Because now you can really count how many there are.
Yeah.
Of significance, the Robertson Panel report of 1953 had a section titled "Lack of Danger," which mentioned Foo Fighters. The panel concluded unanimously that there was no evidence of a direct threat to national security in the objects cited. Instances of Foo Fighters were cited, but were believed to be electrostatic, similar to St. Elmo's fire, or electromagnetic phenomenon, possibly light reflections off of crystals in the air, but the exact cause or nature was never defined. This is a demonstrative lie, given the fact now that we know that Robertson was well aware of the finer details being reported by the air crews almost 10 years prior.
Yeah.
Robertson goes on to name David Griggs as a professor of geophysics at the University of California as being quote, the most knowledgeable person regarding Foo Fighters. However, he failed to mention that both he and Robertson had been aware and were studying the phenomena longer than anyone else, years before the well-publicized first flying saucer sighting reported by Kenneth Arnold in 1947.
So the interesting thing, I just want to say this, the St. Elmo's fire thing. There was an interesting, I'm pretty sure this is right, but I think it's called Speedbird 9. It was a plane that got surrounded in St. Elmo's fire, and then all the engines quit. Right, and then they were drifting down, and then they got the engines restarted, and they tried to regain altitude, and then the engines quit again, and then they had to make an unpowered landing. I'm pretty sure. I can't remember the story exactly, but what they eventually found out was that the plane was flying through a cloud of volcanic ash. Okay, which was invisible to their weather radar at the time. Now I think weather radars are they're designed to see it as a obstruction in the sky, and they always make planes fly around any kind of cloud of volcanic ash. But it was interesting because they're flying through the ash, and it's you can't see it out the window. It's almost invisible, but it made the plane get surrounded in St. Elmo's fire and blew all their engines out. Right?
Yeah.
So I was just thinking about that, like, if there really was that much St. Elmo's fire, it would have killed all their engines.
That St. Elmo's fire is discussed in the book quite a bit. It said the flight crews were well aware of fires. That was something they encountered on a regular basis. So
okay.
They knew that what they were seeing was not St.
Elmo's fire. Yeah, yeah. Okay, and it also it usually actually is on the plane, like.
Yeah, the materials stick to the plane, and you can find it later, right?
Well, what I mean is you can see...
to see the fire.
You can see the fire on the... It looks like the plane wings are on fire with a purplish or bluish hue.
Yeah.
You know? So it's like these guys were seeing these balls of light. Yeah, okay, so the watcher's saying Speedbird 9, British Airways Flight 9. Yeah, that's right. Pretty
Okay.
interesting. Pretty interesting. If anybody's interested in that kind of stuff, check out Speedbird 9, and that flight is very interesting, and it changed the way they deal with flying planes around volcanic ash plumes.
That's cool.
So everything that we've gone over thus far has kind of been a setup for what the real meat of the discussion is here, and it relates to who was the sightings were being attributed to.
Okay.
Edward Ruppelt, the head of Project Blue Book, stated, quote, "Every intelligence report dealing with German World War II aeronautic research had been studied to find out if the Russians could have developed any of the late German designs into flying saucers. Aerodynamicists at Attic and Wright Field's aircraft laboratories computed that the maximum performance they could have expected from the German designs. The designers of the aircrafts themselves were contacted. Could the Russians develop a flying saucer from their designs? The answer was no. There was no conceivable way the aircraft could have performed or matched the reported maneuvers of the UFOs."
So, is there a reason to believe that person?
Well, this was Ruppelt's version. Odds are Ruppelt, just like anything else, everything's so compartmentalized. He only knew the
Yeah.
information that he had access to.
Right.
But we're going to get into more of the details that would support some of what he's, trying to say there.
Okay.
Reginald V. Jones reported to his new job as scientific officer on the staff of Britain's Air Ministry. Because of his background in infrared radar experimentation, Jones was asked by Sir Henry Tizard, committee leader for the Survey of Air Defenses, to learn what the Germans were doing in applying science to air warfare. Reporting to the Directorate of Scientific Research, Jones was placed under the command of Wing Commander F.W. Witherbron, head of the Air Intelligence Branch. His section belonging to the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, better known as MI6. Within days of his assignment, Jones was in the town of Bletchley Park at the estate referred to as Station X, where the place where MI6 stored all of their pre-war files.
But Bletchley Park?
Yes.
Yeah. That's where they did a lot of the decoding stuff, too, I think.
Says for the files, Jones combed the files for hints of what Hitler's Luftwaffe was capable of and what secret weapons were at his disposal. The files were a fantastic read, a gold mine loaded with alleged true stories filled with wild reports of earthquake machines, engine-stopping rays, pilotless aircraft, atomic energy, and bioneurological weapons.
Whoa.
The 8th Air Force issued a report in the September 5th Weekly Intelligence Digest article entitled "Enemy Air Weapons: Some of the Reasons He's Experimenting and Some of the Results of His Labor." In reference to the radio-controlled weapons, the report stated, quote, "These weapons were neither a dream nor a Buck Rogers invention as long ago as the end of the last war. It has been actually tested by reputable scientists," end quote. The Air Force concluded, "It is one thing to correct them against still targets and quite another against fast maneuverable targets such as a plane." The report ended by stating, "The poor results shown against relatively slow and unmaneuverable targets as surface ships indicates what might be expected of similar tactics if similar tactics are employed against aircraft." So what they're saying is that the radio control that the Germans were developing radio control weapons, but here they're saying that they were not very effective even against ships. So what were their chances against fast-moving aircraft?
Yeah. Yep, and then, to do something radio controlled on an object that's out of your sight, if you're just doing it by radar, because you don't have video feed, it's going to be tough.
Actually,
it's gonna be really
the Germans did experiment with video feed.
Over radio?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
It was very crude, but I've seen footage of it. It was very, very crude. I guess it would be the earliest version of a smart, a smart missile, but very crude. But they used a joystick, and they were controlled like was it a Henkel 177? I think it was a Henkel bomber. They would drop this guided radio linked guided missile, and they had this little joystick, and they could actually had a camera on it, and they could steer it into the ship. But it was not very effective.
Because I can tell you, like, having piloted a lot of drones, that moving from piloting the drone, holding the controller in your hand, and having to look at it in the sky, versus having a video feed where you can watch the video feed on the controller and fly it from the perspective of the drone, it's a huge difference.
Oh, and you can imagine
I
the
can
kind of
chase
delay they had
birds
too.
with the video feed drone, but the old one, like, there's no way. There's no way you can.
It's hard to tell how high they are. Or,
exactly.
You think you're right on top of them. And then, no.
Yeah, and then you turn it the wrong direction, or whatever, because it's flying towards you. And yeah.
I'm going to skip a section here, but it's this is referring to some of the reports about other reports of weaponry that they were working on, and there's one of this is kind of relevant to a subject we'll get to later, and it says the files of the committee are being made available to G2 Division in order to facilitate continuity of work. Included is the intelligence information on crossbow, together with many detailed studies, both Allied and Axis, on pertinent subjects such as rockets, refrigerant bombs, proximity fuses, electronic bombing techniques, and probabilities. Fuels for rockets, turbines, anthroid, which is ramjet propulsion units, biological warfare.
Ramjets.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's what, like the V1 used a ramjet.
Okay.
German scientific institutions, personalities, balloon barrages, guided missiles, and this one's strange, artificial detection of Earth's magnetic field.
Huh.
These were some of Germany's experimental programs.
Right.
On December 19, 1944, General George Strong, Chief of U.S. Army Intelligence, sent a priority memo signed by General Eisenhower to General Clayton Bissell, Office of the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence in the War Department, stating, quote, no concrete evidence as to use of secret weapons has been obtained thus far, with the exception of the report of a new long-range projectile. An Army Air Force spokesman at the Pentagon gave a brief official statement offering what they knew about the mysterious objects. His comments were supported in a, quote, special to the New York Times under the headline, Berlin's device is futile. Silver spears above city have no effect, Capital says. The December 21st, 1944 report stated, quote, no detectable effects have been noted but from the mysterious silver balls that the American pilots recently reported floating over Berlin, an official Army Air Force spokesman said today. The objects were described as silver or silver-colored, but the Army Air Force does not know whether they are metal, and the spokesman said he added that the descriptions contained in newspaper reports sent to headquarters had been sent to headquarters, and that there were no reports from the theater. And we know this statement was demonstrably false.
Yeah.
They're saying they were not seeing them in the theater of warfare,
which is newspaper.
That's where they were actually coming from. So they're sending mixed messages. And again, here we have, just like we talked about in part one, here we have the military sending mixed messages to the media that seemingly contradict themselves.
And I mean, that last report, he seemed to be saying that, like, the reports of these spheres all came from media and not the actual theater of war. That's what it sounded like?
Right. That's what he's trying to say.
No, the media was getting the reports from the theater of war, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It was a hoax fad.
Another hoax fad.
On May 14th, 1945, USS Sutton received confirmation that German U-boat 234 en route to Japan was surrendering in the North Atlantic. On board were 3 complete disassembled aircrafts, an Me-262, an Me-163, and a Me-309 single-seat fighter. This was their, quote, high-altitude pressure cabin that was proposed for the Henschel 130 stratospheric aircraft. An assortment of jet engines and a complete set of blueprints and documents associated with all of the above.
Wow.
But the 234 was no ordinary U-boat. A secondary examination showed that it had been modified to carry a very dangerous cargo. Set in her 6 adapted mine-laying tubes were 560 kilos of uranium held in 10 gold-lined containers. The loading manifest maintained that it was uranium oxide, the state of which uranium is found when it's extracted from the earth and safe enough to carry around in a paper bag. That the U-234's converted mine-laying tubes were gold-lined indicated that the cargo was emitting gamma radiation. This in turn meant that the uranium oxide ore had been subjected to enrichment from a working nuclear reactor. The gold lining was there to prevent the radiation from penetrating the U-boat's hull.
What?
Yeah, that's surprising.
Yeah.
That suggests that
they had
were
a working
further
nuclear
along.
reactor.
Well, they
Yeah.
were further along than what we were ever told.
Yeah.
And we'll get to more of that in a bit.
Was
Also,
the sub supposed to drop that stuff?
it was actually en route to Japan, and then they decided to surrender.
Yeah, they defected or something.
Right. And on board were 9 Germans. At the top of the list was Air Force General Ulrich Kessler. He was particularly well-versed in fire control devices, anti-aircraft guided missiles, and remote control missiles. Another passenger was Oberleutnant der Luftwaffe Erich Menzel, an air communications specialist, an expert in many fields who contributed to the development of new radar systems, bomb sights, radar reconnaissance methods, and radio control weapons. Others on board were August Bringwald and Franz Ruff Bringwald. He was Will Messerschmitt's right-hand man and the Messerschmitt's factory top engineer, an expert on airframes for jets and rocket propulsion. And he was sent to get the Me-262s into mass production and get the Me-163 program up and running.
Yeah, the Messerschmitts were the jet engine fighters, right?
So they were sent, the 262 was the first fighter. The 163 was the little Comet. These were being sent to Japan.
Right.
Now, Germany had surrendered, and they were trying to export their technology to help the Japanese.
Yeah. So maybe they were bringing enriched uranium to the Japanese to start up a reactor or something? Or build
That's
bombs?
what it would suggest, because now this is coming from one book. I have information coming from 2 different books that they actually are both kind of saying the same thing, but little details are left out between the two. The most important passenger to the Allied air intelligence was Luftwaffe Colonel Fritz von Stardart, formerly in charge of the city of Bremen's anti-aircraft defenses. He was involved with the latest experimental anti-aircraft weaponry. His background afforded him possible knowledge pertaining to the Foo Fighter mystery.
Okay.
Interrogating officer Captain Hale asked Colonel Stardart, Allied crewmen operating over Germany late last year reported encountering colored balls of fire. What is the explanation for those balls of fire? Were they due to the use of any secret German weapon? If so, what was the weapon and how successful was it? According to Captain Hale's report, the prisoner of war asserts that the colored balls encountered by air crews operating over Germany were only experimental weapons, later shelved as impractical in operation. It was a weapon used by the Air Force and not by anti-aircraft units. Planes would climb far above the ceiling of the enemy bombers and released with a time fuse, which theoretically would detonate on the level of the attacking formation. The success, however, placed the idea back into, or the lack of success, placed the idea back in the experimental phase. The prisoner is at a loss to give any further information and suggests that the technical people in the Luftwaffe, especially those familiar with experiments, would be the ones to approach. That was a bit of disinformation, as we'll find out. They did have, early in the war, some of the bomber crews encountered these small, they look like coins. They said they were like silver dollars that would rain down on them, and they weren't sure what they were, and they would stick to the planes, and they figured that they were testing some type of a explosive device, but no aircraft were ever harmed by them. But that sounds like what he's talking about. He's confusing the Foo Fighter sightings with this other. In other words, keep in mind that
like these air mines.
That again, the Germans were pretty good about compartmentalizing their information as well. So he may not have been aware. Let's say theoretically there was that the Foo Fighters were some type of a Nazi super secret weapon.
Yeah.
What he was privy to were these other weapons that were used and using this time fuse.
Yeah.
But that's going to play into some of the information that comes later also.
Okay. So did any of these planes fly home with these little coins stuck to them?
Apparently they did recover some, but they didn't know what they were for. That's why they made the assumption that they must have been testing something that would be used later, because they didn't have explosive, but they assumed that was what they were.
It sounds like poltergeist activity, you know,
raining down from the sky.
Yeah, they're throwing coins at you. Little balls of light in the sky throwing coins at you. It sounds like a poltergeist. It's weird.
So the gentleman that worked at Messerschmitt, one of the informants says he saw the balls of fire over Munich once and assumed that they were some type of new anti-aircraft defense operating on an acoustical principle. No definite explanation of the phenomenon could be offered. The RAF's interrogation of the U-234 passengers had revealed nothing further than about the balls of fire, other than it was a mystery even to the Germans.
Yeah.
Following the surrender of the architect of Germany's Luftwaffe, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, was interrogated by General Spaatz and was asked if he had had a chance to go back in time and redesign the Luftwaffe, what would be the first plane that he would develop. Göring replied, jet fighters and bombers, especially the Me-264, the bomber that was designed to fly to America and back. Göring further stated, quote, I might add that according to my view, the future airplane is one without a fuselage, a flying wing, equipped with a turbine in combination with a jet and propeller. Unquote. Near Gotha, a cache of approximately 5 tons of top-secret documents covering the entire field of German arms development and industrial mobilization for war were located in a salt mine. Fortunately, they were recovered from Nazi SS soldiers in the process of destroying them. Another incredible discovery of documentation was found in an abandoned mine shaft where 250,000 volumes of German from the German Patent Office were hidden. Documentation relevant to the Foo Fighter investigation surrounded radar and electronics, specifically known as the Schwarzsteinfeger project. The documentation contained radar camouflage and development of materials absorbing electromagnetic and supersonic waves, and revealed Germany's progress regarding, quote, complete anti-radar coverage of submarines and other equipment, unquote. So they were working on stealth technology back in World War II.
You think some of this phenomenon, I mean, because that guy was saying that they might be acoustical, but that made me start thinking like, well, there were all kinds of weird, I mean, it was brand new radar. Some of these planes had radar, the bomber planes, and then the Germans are shooting radar up there. Could that be causing some kind of weird electromagnetic phenomena that looks like balls of light?
But keep in mind that they said there were 3 distinct types of Foo Fighters.
Yeah.
Some were single balls of light, some were multiple balls of light in a row, and then some had as many as 15
Yeah.
that were blinking in alternating patterns like a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
And some of these people reported silver-structured objects. They were
Right.
just balls of light. And it
Yeah.
depends. In other words, the ones that saw them at night saw these balls of light. The ones
Yeah.
that saw them in the day saw structured craft.
Okay.
So on September 6, 1945, David Griggs and E.G. Schneider, representing General Kenny's advisory specialist group, arrived at the Astungee Airdrome with 4 other military officers and 4 men from E.L. Moreland's Pacific Branch, calling themselves a scientific intelligence mission, formally set up under Moreland's guidance. Moreland was the advisor to General MacArthur and headed the new scientific and technical advisory section of the Pacific Armed Forces General Headquarters. Griggs knew, quote, about 3 regions that generated a high frequency of Foo Fighter sightings over South Tokyo. Armed with an excellent interpreter, he was able to draw information from a huge list of important Japanese scientists at his disposal. In Tokyo, Griggs conducted interrogations and gained the confidence of one Japanese officer attached to headquarters. During questioning, Griggs relayed the balls of fire information to the Japanese officer who in turn found the sightings just as interesting as the United States Army Air Force had found them. The circumstances in Japan were repeating just as those in Germany. The enemy seemed as surprised about the unusual sightings as the U.S. was.
So they started showing up in Japan too.
Right.
Yeah. The Watcher's showing us pictures of that.
Yeah, that's the HO-229. That's the world's first stealth fighter.
Man, look at that thing.
That plane was captured or recovered during Operation Paperclip by the British, and they stored it away in a warehouse, and it sat there until the 60s. They had no idea what it was.
Oh, wow.
And they
looks tiny.
gave it to the United States. They go, we don't know what this thing is or what its purpose is. So they gave it to the United States, and that got the ball rolling on stealth technology.
Man, look at that thing.
Yeah, that thing had a rubberized carbon coating to absorb radar. Had the jet engines mounted inside on the top side so that you couldn't see the exhaust. Flying wing, slender so that it couldn't be spotted by other fighters head on. Yeah, that thing was 50, 60 years
Germans
ahead.
knew what they was doing. God, that's awesome looking. Yeah. We got to take a break. Yeah.
Good timing.
Yep, good timing. Man, that plane is awesome.
This is really cool.
Yeah. All right. We'll be back for the final segment, fastest 2 hours in podcasting.
And we are back for the final segment, possibly. Not sure, but ready to get back into it. What do you got, buddy?
All right, we're going to shift gears again. Okay, here. Both during and following the Second World War, German counterintelligence agencies were actively engaged in disseminating propaganda about several of the incredible super weapons, which would change the tide of the war and ensure a Nazi victory. Some of this propaganda was relayed to the Allied intelligence agents as fact by former Nazis who either deliberately misrepresented the truth or those who had blind faith in the accuracy of the stories being circulated. Rumors of German superweapons came in many forms, but none are more commonly cited than the Nazi flying saucers. Researcher William Moore has investigated the subject extensively and published a very informative article in Far Out magazine in 1993. The most commonly cited source for the Nazi flying saucer development lore is Italian technician Renato Vesco, who authored the book Intercept But Don't Shoot, The True Story of the Flying Saucers in 1968. In his book, Vesco states, the principle of symmetrical circular aircraft was combined with gyroscopic stabilization. This marked the rapid development of the fireball, which finally became a weapon. Research indicates that the development of the V-7 Führerball, a circular aircraft powered by conventional jet engines, likely did take place near the end of the war. Evidence does support the construction of at least one and possibly more experimental prototypes. But test flights proved less than spectacular. Recovery of related documents and hardware may have led to the U.S. military's development in the late 50s of the VZ-9 Avrocar and the more advanced Project Y and Y-2 Silverbug. However, like the Führerball, these two failed to perform as projected.
What was it called? The V? What the what'd you say?
The V-7 Führerball.
Okay.
Like the Führer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually Fireball.
Yeah.
Fireball fighter
Okay.
in German.
Oh.
Be that as it may, Vasco's book included claims of yet another Nazi flying saucer, the Kugelblitz, which means ball lightning. And this is where the true disinformation lied. Vesco wrote, quote, the Kugelblitz, which apparently for greater safety combined the electrostatic firing device with an autonomous shortwave device manufactured by the Patent Verwergenten Gesellschaft of Salzburg, lumping together a single compact mass, the wing and tail and fuselage of ordinary planes, but had nothing in common with them in either form or performance. It was the first example of the jet lift aircraft, unquote. After a single lucky wartime mission, the Kugelblitz was subsequently destroyed by technical detachments of retreating SS troops. Vesco goes on to state, even if ufologists refuse to admit it, the Kugelblitz, the older brother of the Führerball, is the authentic antecedent of the present-day flying saucers. And it is with them that the true history, or if you will, the prehistory of UFOs began. This belief was reiterated by W.A. Herbinson in his book Genesis, published in 1980. He writes, it is not confirmed, but it is very possible that the German Führerball existed, that it accounted for many of the first modern UFO sightings during the Second World War, and that the extraordinary flying machine, the Kugelblitz, was successfully flown in Germany a few weeks before the war ended. The Führerball, therefore, could have been the forerunner of the small, seemingly remote-controlled UFOs observed frequently through the final months of the war, while the Kugelblitz could have been the first of the large pilot-controlled flying saucers. Proof of the disinformation campaign surrounding the Kugelblitz is contained in a declassified 1946 report by the Air Division U.S. Forces in Austria, released in the early 1990s through the Freedom of Information Act. As with all good disinformation, largely credible information is used to convey an inaccurate narrative. This is precisely what is contained in Vasco's account of the Kugelblitz. Moore states, virtually every detail turns out to be true except the most important one. The Kugelblitz wasn't a flying disc at all. It was actually being developed as an experimental anti-aircraft rocket. The declassified Air Division report states, quote, the Patent Verwertung Gesellschaft, the German guys had an unimpressive start on 1st September 1943 as a private firm for the development of certain patents. Kugelblitz was a high-frequency shortwave proximity ignition device for flak rockets. It was developed in 3 successive models, each an improvement on the previous one. The final model was ready for production in January of 1945, but never reached the production line. Parts of the Kugelblitz, but not the whole model, are at the laboratory site. It was intended to be used as an automatic ignition device for several of the German self-searching flak rockets in development. The success of the Kugelblitz proved was proved in in-flight tests before the official committee at Arning Airfield, and the device was considered to be the best of all types. So, in effect, the report reveals that the electrostatic firing device with analogous shortwave device detailed by Vasco was accurate, but it was actually describing a proximity detonation device manufactured by the German guys for the use in flak rockets. So again, it was, mostly accurate, but the device was completely a different thing. So you can understand the secrecy of it. In other words, the patent really was related to a proximity switch.
Yeah.
Where before they were, and I kind of purposely put this in there, I just didn't emphasize it, but there was, when I said earlier that one of the prisoner of war that was interviewed said that the rockets used a timing device, and I said that was disinformation, is because they were actually testing the proximity switch. It was the proximity switch that was the big secret. So, having said that, much of the following information comes to us from the outstanding book, The Hunt for Zero Point by Nick Cook, aviation author and editor for Jane's Defense Weekly. A central figure in the book is one of particular relevance to this discussion is an individual named Dr. Hans Kammler. Kammler was an engineer who rose through the ranks of the SS, where he became the head of the Building and Works Division, designing and constructing SS concentration camps such as the famous Auschwitz, as well as underground construction facilities for the V-2 rocket program. He was described as a cold, ruthless schemer, a fanatic in the pursuit of a goal, and carefully calculating as he was unscrupulous. As his influence grew within the SS, Kammler was eventually given full responsibility of all aspects of the V-2 program. Then on February 6, 1944, Hitler transferred cradle-to-grave responsibility for all air weapons, fighters, missiles, and bombers to Kammler, who was viewed as the most powerful and influential state official outside of Hitler's cabinet. For his development of methodologies for increasing output of the gas chambers from 10,000 to 60,000 per day, he was rewarded with the rank of SS General Obergruppenführer. This gave Kammler, Kammler acquired control of every single aircraft and aerospace program within the Third Reich. Most of you have probably never heard of Kammler. This is because despite his vast accomplishments and rapid rise to power, historical archives contain almost no mention of him whatsoever. In fact, none of this information would have come to light had it not been for a chance meeting. After extensive research, both inside and out of Germany, Nick Cook learned through a contact of a Cambridge graduate and foreign correspondent named Tom Augustin. During World War II, Augustin served as an air photo interpreter, and after he traveled to Germany to report on the Nuremberg War Crimes Trials. While covering the trials, Augustin met SS Standarführer, which just means Colonel, Wilhelm Voss, and subsequently in 1949 conducted several confidential interviews with him. Although Voss was extensively interrogated by the Counterintelligence Corps, none of the records or transcripts of the interrogations could be obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. Respecting Voss's wishes, Augustin did not disclose any of the information until that he was given until after Voss's death in 1974. Those details were published in the book Blunder: How the U.S. Government Gave Away Nazi Super Secrets to Russia. That's the book I told you I found that was $850.
Oh, yeah.
In the book, Augustin detailed how Kammler, unbeknownst to anyone outside of the project, created a top-secret research center for advanced weapons, or what we would today refer to as black projects. Voss was Kammler's head administrator at the Kammerschlab, the Special Operations Center located in a highly compartmentalized section of the Skoda Works in the Reich Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in the then Nazi state of Czechoslovakia. Voss described the activities of the scientists at the Kammerschlab as beyond any technology that had appeared by the end of the war, working on weapon systems that made the V-1 and V-2 look pedestrian. Among these were nuclear power plants for rockets and aircraft, highly advanced guided weapons, and anti-aircraft lasers.
Whoa. Nuclear power plants for rockets. Man.
Near the end of the war, Kammler recognized that his exploits would have placed him high on the list of SS officers sought by the Allies for war crimes. However, Kammler had something of value to deal, something tangible. Kammler told Albert Speer, head of Nazi armaments program, he was planning to contact the Americans and that in exchange for a guarantee of his freedom, he would offer them everything. Jet planes as well as the A-4, which was the V-2 rocket, and other important developments. He informed Speer that he was assembling all the relevant experts in Upper Bavaria in order to hand them over to the U.S. forces. On April 17th, the Third Reich crashing around his ears, with the Third Reich crashing around his ears, Kammler sent a message to Himmler at the SS command headquarters in Berlin, denying Himmler the use of a heavy truck that the Reichsfuhrer SS had requested from the Junkers aircraft factory motor pool. This was the last message anyone ever received from Kammler, who by April 18th had dropped off the map, effectively disappearing without a trace. When Augustin searched for records on Kammler, he discovered that his name hadn't even been registered at the Nuremberg war crimes trial. The very least that might have been expected for someone who had played such a prominent role in the Holocaust. Kammler was never tried in absentia at Nuremberg. There is no evidence that anyone ever bothered to even look for him. This despite the fact that there are 4 versions of his death which conflict with conflicting information, and remarkably, none of them stacks up under scrutiny. Kammler didn't seem like a man who would gamble his life on providing America with a technology that it already had acquired via diligent detective work. Augustin's feeling was that Kammler would offer them something so spectacular that they would have no choice but to enter into negotiations with him.
So, is this implying that he was taken in secret by the Americans?
Right. Here we have...
Or that he escaped somewhere, like to South America?
What they claim to be the most powerful person outside of Hitler's cabinet.
Yeah.
Disappeared without a trace, was never tried, and no one went looking for him.
Yeah. That seems...
Yeah, if he disappeared, people would have been looking for him.
Right.
So the fact that no one went looking for him, well, yeah, the Watcher's saying Antarctica to Antarctica to Antarctica to Antarctica. But I mean, then people would have been looking for him. So it's like his whole, like his record was just wiped clean, and
he was
taken
taken in outside of Paperclip.
Ooh.
Through a reliable contact, Nick Cook learned of a series of experiments that had allegedly taken place in a mine in a valley close to the Czech border. They had begun in 1944 and carried on into April of the following year, right under the nose of the advancing Russians. The experiments required large amounts of electricity fed via thick cabling into a chamber hundreds of meters below ground. In the chamber, a bell-shaped device comprised of 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with mercury or something like it had emitted a strange pale blue glow. A number of scientists who had been exposed to the device during the experiments suffered terrible side effects. 5 of them were said to have died as a result. Word had it that these results sought to investigate some kind of anti-gravitational effect. but Cook was skeptical.
Yeah.
His research had uncovered the existence of an SS-run Special Evacuation Commando, which means command or command unit, that had evacuated the Bell and its supporting documentation prior to the Russians overrunning the facility. Cook inquired about the fate of the scientists operating the facility and was informed that they were taken out and shot by the SS between April 28th and May 4th of 1945. Records show that there were 62 of them, many of them German, and there were no survivors, which is hardly surprising. The project had gone under two names, Lantern Tiger and Kronos, and always involved the Glocke, the bell-shaped object that had glowed when under testing. The bell itself was made out of a hard, heavy metal and was filled with a mercury-like substance, violet in color. This metallic liquid was stored in tall, thin thermos flasks, a meter high, encased in lead 3 centimeters thick. The experiments always took place under a thick ceramic cover and involved rapid spinning of 2 cylinders in opposite directions. The mercury-like substance was codenamed Cerium-525. The other substances used included thorium and beryllium peroxides, codenamed lectermetal. Lectmetal.
Electrum.
The chamber in which the experiments took place was situated in a gallery deep below ground. It had a floor area of approximately 30 square meters, and its walls were covered with ceramic tiles with a thick overlay of rubber matting. After approximately 10 tests, the room was dismantled and the compartment parts were destroyed. Only the bell itself was preserved. The rubber mats were replaced every 2 to 3 experiments and were disposed of in a special furnace. Each test lasted approximately 1 minute. During this period, while the bell emitted its pale blue glow, personnel were kept 150 to 200 yards from it. Electrical equipment anywhere within the radius would usually short circuit or break down. Afterwards, the room was doused for up to 45 minutes with a liquid that appeared to be brine. The men who performed this task were concentration camp prisoners from Grossrosen. During the tests, scientists placed various types of plants, animals, and animal tissues in the Bell sphere of influence. In the initial test period, from November to December 1944, most of the samples were destroyed. The crystalline substance formed within the tissue, destroying them from the inside. Liquids, including blood, gelled and separated into clear distilled fractions. Plants exposed to the bell included moss, ferns, fungi, and molds. Animal tissues, including eggs, blood, meat, and milk, and animals themselves ranged from insects to snails and lizards, frogs, mice, and rats. With the plants, chlorophyll was observed to decompose and disappear, turning the plants white for 4 to 5 hours after the experiment. Within 8 to 14 hours, rapid decay set in, but it differed from normal decomposition in that there was no accompanying smell. By the end of the period, the plants usually decomposed into a substance that had the consistency of axle grease. This all sounds crazy. This sounds like a lot of speculation, right? Cook was skeptical of all this information that he was getting. People exposed to the program complained of ailments despite their protective clothing. These ranged from sleep problems, loss of memory and balance, muscle spasms, and permanent and unpleasant metallic tastes in their mouth.
It does sound like radiation poisoning.
Cook was intrigued but not convinced as he traveled to the alleged location of the tests, which was called the Wenchless Mine, 50 kilometers or more outside of Warklaw, formerly Burslow of Lower Silesia, around 350 kilometers from Wausau. Upon arrival, Cook commented, "In short, the Germans had gone to a great deal of trouble to ensure that the place looked pretty much as it had looked since the mining operation began here at the turn of the last century. A clear indication that whatever had happened here during the war had been deeply secret. The site contained a power station capable of burning 1,000 tons of coal per day, making the place entirely self-sufficient. But most striking was a circular concrete construction 30 meters wide and 10 feet high, and 10 high, with its 12-meter thick columns and horizontal beams giving it the appearance of a henge.
I think I've seen is there a picture of that?
Yeah, I've seen pictures of it.
Yeah,
Pretty
okay.
impressive looking structure.
Yeah.
The ground within the structure had been excavated to a depth of 1 meter and lined with the same ceramic tiles described as in the chamber that contained the bell. There were also high-strength steel hooks set into the tops of the columns, which appeared to attach to something.
Yeah.
Something that must have exerted a lot of power. The structure was believed to have been a test rig for a vehicle or engine of some kind, one that was very powerful.
Yeah, it kind of like you could think of it as where NASA would mount a rocket engine to a fixed structure and then fire it off for a certain amount of time to test it. And there would be these incredibly reinforced concrete structures that the rocket would mount to. But this was a circular.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing
Yeah.
something about this on Ancient Aliens at some point.
Yeah.
Following the visit to the Venslot's mine, Cook began to connect the dots. The Special Evacuations Commando Unit, which it was said to have evacuated the Bell, operated Ju-290 and 390 transport aircraft on detachment. The Ju-290 was a rare bird, and the 390 more so. The 290 had been a big four-engined aircraft designed for maritime reconnaissance, transport, and bombing roles. The final variants were modified for extreme long-range operations. The Ju-390 was a six-engine modification of the Ju-290 and even more impressive. Though only 2 prototypes were built, they clearly demonstrated the 390's ability to mount ultra-long-range operations up to 32 hours of endurance. It could also carry very heavy payloads. When Kammler had telexed Himmler on April 17th, the last signal that anyone ever received from him, refusing the Reichsführer's SS the use of the heavy truck from the Junkers motor pool, he hadn't been referring to a truck in the conventional sense. He had been referring to an aircraft, a long-range one with a heavy payload. Kammler had been telling Himmler, his superior, that he couldn't have the Junkers 290 or 390 for his own use because it was committed elsewhere. It could only have been for the use of the Special Evacuation Commando. Kammler had the ability to vacuum up all scientific activity, whether it was theoretical or practical, through an SS organization called the FEP, which was Research, Development, and Patents. Kammler could safely refuse Himmler permission to use the Ju-290 and 390 without fear of recrimination. With such aircraft at his disposal, the commando could have flown its cargo and documents, personnel and technology pretty much anywhere it wanted. Spain, South America, Argentina, or even would not have represented a problem for such a long-range platform.
Yeah, the watchers put up a picture of the 290 up here.
Back in Germany, Cook began to ponder. Maybe the Nazis had initiated a flying saucer program. Maybe some of the technology had borne fruit. There were certainly enough anecdotal evidence to support the view that a variety of disc-shaped craft had been flown before the end of the war. It was simply that there was no proof. In his journey to Kammler's kingdom, it had opened his mind to the possibilities that he would not have begun to entertain a few months earlier. Via the Kammler Trail, a mounting body of evidence suggested that the Nazis, in their desperation to win the war, had been experimenting with a form of science the rest of the world had never remotely considered, and that somewhere in the cauldron of ideas, a new technology had been born, one that was so far ahead of its time that it was suppressed for half a century. And we haven't even touched on Victor Schwarberger's repulsing.
So this is are you basically saying that the Nazi bell was you think it was just a real thing, or a Cook did? Eventually, he became convinced of it.
Well, I've listened to interviews with Cook about this, and he's on the fence. He says he's leaning towards believing that the bell was some form of nuclear device.
Okay.
He says he doesn't know that it was for anti-gravity purposes. He thinks that's speculation.
Yeah.
But he is convinced that the bell was a real weapon. It was something being developed.
Yeah.
But they just don't know what it was for.
Okay.
But there is enough anecdotal evidence to support the development.
And the other idea that's being said here is that not only was it being developed, whatever it was, but this guy got away with the technology and went somewhere with it.
And just vanished.
And just disappeared.
Now, there's kind of 2 points. That's one, is that there evidently was some form of technology under development. But the other point to be taken from this was that even from all of this data, which, kind of supports the idea of that this stuff was being worked on, it's clear that this was at the end of the war.
Yeah.
That nothing of any real substance had been produced prior to that. So
yeah, they were still working
in other words,
on it.
the Foo Fighters that were being observed were not this technology. This was not mature enough to have been used during the war.
Yeah.
Now, what came of it after the war is a whole separate question.
Yeah.
Do you think this is a product of reverse engineering?
It's hard to say. I mean, the Germans were not afraid to test new ideas. They definitely had. The book goes into talking about how they kind of set up the groundwork for what today would be called, the special, black project stuff, where they're small crews of scientists working with not a whole lot of, oversight.
Yeah.
Which allows them to progress more rapidly with ideas.
Right. Skunk works.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
The closing comments on this kind of go in that exact direction. He says, from 1933 through 1945, unconventional aircraft were observed around the world. These flying objects were given a variety of names: mystery planes, ghost aviators, phantom flyers, freaks, meteors, comets, balls of fire, lights, the Thing, and Foo Fighters. Nearly a decade after the CIA's 1953 Robertson panel would state, if the term flying saucers had been popular in 1943 to 1945, these objects would have been labeled so. The balls of fire and Foo Fighters during the war became the ghost rockets of 1946. This new term was introduced primarily due to the flights of the objects over Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark.
Yep.
Eventually expanding through Europe, including Portugal, France, Tangier, Italy, Greece, and India.
I didn't know they were seen over India.
By the summer of 1947, the term flying saucer had arrived and spread globally. Then in 1956, the U.S. Air Force began calling them unidentified flying objects. The dates, physical descriptions, flight characteristics, and non-aggressive nature of the unidentified objects commonly referred to as Foo Fighters, when compared to the historical record and statements from U.S., British, and German officials themselves, all but rule out any possibility that the objects observed prior or during the war were Nazi superweapons. However, there is ample evidence to support the possibility that some advanced technology, although still in the developmental phase, at the end of the war, were procured by the Allied and Russian militaries. Further development of these technologies post-war had the potential to result in hardware which may have been responsible for some of the UFO reports beginning in the late 40s.
Okay. Yeah.
Given the unit's experience with Foo Fighters during the war, in 2003, Major Augusper, commanding officer of the American 415th Night Fighter Squadron, was asked by Keith Chester what he thought the Foo Fighters were. He replied, quote, "Well, I think they were extraterrestrial objects of some kind. At that particular time, I didn't think much of anything like that. But as time goes by, I think they were something from outer space. I just believe those things. But what I saw, I think, was extraterrestrial, something from outer space." So the air crews
Yeah.
couldn't make sense out of it.
Right.
In other words, the flight characteristics were so unconventional, they did not believe they could have been man-made.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe we could make something like that eventually. But the idea here is that based on even their most secret technology that's being figured out later, it doesn't seem like they had that technology, especially not to make the ones that were showing up in the 30s.
Right, and that's where this is the third time I'll bring this up, that the context issue, that you have to keep a frame of reference that doesn't discount certain periods. In other words, it's very easy to look at what's going on today and say, "Oh, well, that's military, top secret military stuff."
Yeah, exactly.
And it's easy for people to say, "Oh, the Foo Fighters were secret Nazi developments." Well, but you have to look at the big picture of things to see that these same objects were seen prior to the war, when we know there's no way that these things existed. Even the ME-262 didn't show up, which is, their jet fighters didn't show up till near the end of the war. They showed up too late to make a difference.
Right.
So how could they have had these, the technology to develop craft that could hover or fly up into the sky and disappear and everything prior to the war? They would have been used throughout the war if that was the case.
Yeah. Especially if they had ones that were 3 football fields long.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
that's terrifying. If that's being used as a weapon against you,
Right. So I'm kind of skirting down the middle. I'm saying, were there Nazi super weapons during the war? No, but they were working on things that we may have seen post-war.
Yeah, and there were Nazi super weapons, but they were conventional weapons that we could understand. But yeah, they rolled out a military full of weapons that no one had ever seen before. I mean, that was part of the thing that terrified everyone with the war. It was scary.
And how much of the things that they talked that they were working on might have become a reality?
Yeah.
Things related to Earth's magnetic field and laser weapons and all these. It's hard to say. A lot of it might have been disinformation, but who knows? Some of it they might have actually been worried. It doesn't mean that they ever got anywhere with it, but they weren't afraid to try new things.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we've talked about this before, but I have the same problem sometimes with with the idea that some of these things are modern military weapons, because I'm like, well, why aren't they ever used? We go to war with somebody and I don't ever see any flying saucers shooting lasers at people.
Well, the silver bullet theory, is valid. In other words, during the war, during World War II, it was quantity. In other words, they built hundreds of individual aircrafts to perform tasks.
Yeah.
That changed as we got into Vietnam. They started getting more specialized, and they started figuring out, that they could do more with less. That was kind of the idea that the F-117, it only represented something like 10% of all aircraft used in the Gulf War, but it was represented 60% of the damage. In other words, they were doing a lot with a little. Well, the concept is that we have these silver bullets that they may only develop a handful of them, and they're very specialized, and they're probably kept in secure hangars and only taken out on rare occasion, but they're there in case you ever need them.
Yeah.
And they may have.
You made this point with the hostage situation in Tehran.
Correct.
Right? That before all this happened, there was this sighting of this craft that did all this stuff and just made their Air Force look like crap. But then we like strapped rockets to a big plane trying to get in there to get the hostages out, and it totally failed.
Right.
So, like, why didn't they use that silver bullet if they had it? Right?
I have a lot of notes for that aspect that we would look at. We could discuss comparing, modern day observations, and using that that context of looking at, well, were these exact same things being described in the 30s, in the late 1800s? We tend to have these knee-jerk reactions and say, well, that's probably just military. And I agree. Occam's razor, it's most likely a military aircraft. But when you're seeing things that have been described for over a century, that unless we've developed time travel, that's very unlikely. In other words, this was something that was pre-existing. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't
eventually
learn how to develop our own versions of that technology. Recovered through crash material. There's no telling. But I would say there is no doubt that we have technologies out there that would seem practically supernatural. I bet you we have very high speed, amazing aircraft. But how do you make the distinction between the ones that may not be? For all we know, they may not be physical.
Right. That's the other thing is, like, yes, I agree that our military probably has stuff that would look like magic. But I bet you if you got the blueprints, you would be like, oh, I see how that works. For the most part, it's got a turbine in there somewhere. It's using airflow and fuel. In other words, it isn't using it. It won't float, and then dive down into the ocean and then take off up into the stratosphere in a couple of seconds. Like, I don't think we have anything like that. Maybe we do, but if it is, it's so completely different from all the jets and stuff that they're still building.
Well, it is.
Then why wouldn't they be incorporating some of that technology into the why wouldn't you stick that in the jet?
It is interesting that the Navy has been so vocal about their investigation of the Tic Tac UFO and all this, and the Air Force has been totally silent.
Yeah. Yeah, like the Air Force is like, yeah, that was us. Sorry, guys. That's possible. Yeah, I know that that's the left hand, right hand thing. These branches of the military don't know what the other branches are doing or whatever. But then you're like, okay, well, why was the Air Force buzzing the Navy? And is that just like they're just like, haha, check this out?
And wouldn't there be wouldn't there be communications go, hey man, you're doxing us here. What are you doing? Putting the video on the internet,
right? Yeah. And that's the other thing is like my other problem with some of this stuff is if it's super secret, super secret military craft, why are they flying it over giant cities really slow so everyone can see it? Like the Phoenix Lights, it's like, okay, that's a giant super secret military craft, and then they just fly it over Phoenix.
Theoretically, some of it could be psyop, I don't know.
And why would you fly it with other Air Force pilots so that they would be reporting like, hey, I saw this weird thing in the sky? There's no point in doing that.
Yeah.
So that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And again, we may not be looking at one thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
There may be a mix of things, and it's hard to determine which ones are ours and which ones aren't.
Yeah. There's Nazis in Antarctica.
I do have one question about the breakaway civilization, because that I know that's another aspect we didn't dive into, but the breakaway civilization stuff, saying, well, Nazis created a base in Antarctica. Well, surely, given the technology we have, we would know that they were there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, in the 50s and 60s, because of the Cold War and fear of an attack, we developed the distant early warnings, radar array
over the horizon.
Right. To be able to detect aircraft coming in, bombers or whatever, right? So logically, if that was true, we would have a due line south because we would be afraid of aircraft coming from the south.
Yeah.
why is there not one?
Well, there might be. I don't know if do they have any OTH down in the.
No, I mean I'm right there. I mean, it would have to be in South America or something.
That's what I mean.
Mexico
You
certainly
put it down
doesn't have
down at the tip of South America.
I don't think it would
That's
be
where I'd put
tough
it.
to build a construction project that large without it being detectable.
Yeah.
In other words, I think it'd be pretty much common knowledge. I mean, the dew line was common knowledge.
Yeah.
I mean, they had to develop all types of special transports and stuff to be able to do it. Of course, the conditions in it,
Yeah.
up in
The other possibility is you just have ships in the area all the time looking for it because they have OTH.
possibly. I have difficulty with the breakaway civilization
But it may,
thing.
well, yeah.
Only because
they may have a
it's-
treaty. So, like the idea of a breakaway civilization that some part of the major world governments have knowledge of, that there is an agreement. And part of the agreement may be that you're not going to be building any installations. That's why you can't build bases in Antarctica.
But how do you get every nation in the world to agree not to fight with one? It's just not. It's not human nature. There's always
if they
conflict.
have UFOs?
Well, I mean,
I mean, like, I don't know. That's the whole point. Yeah, we went back and forth.
That
through
in
it.
itself would be, cause for some to try to recover that. In other words, I don't think any nation is going to allow some other nation to have a technology without responding to it. In other words, if some breakaway civilization had some super hyper advanced technology, all the other superpowers would be doing everything within their ability to try to recover it and duplicate it.
Unless there was some kind of agreement that there was a trade of that information. But yeah, I agree.
But then that would put them at risk.
It would put them at risk. Yeah. Yeah.
The only way you keep a secret is to limit who knows about it.
Yeah.
But if all the nations in the world know about it, they wouldn't be able to keep it a secret.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the biggest part of a breakaway civilization is that it hides. And so you would be like they may know you're in Antarctica, but where? It's pretty big.
Yeah.
And if you're under the ice,
If you had anti-gravity technology, you could also be all over space.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like wherever you want to be. you
Yeah.
could be
Nazis in space.
that's right.
there. I'm just saying, it's like it wouldn't be necessarily a landmass that they're like, oh well, we need to be looking to the south because you
Yeah.
could just go into space and come down from wherever you want.
Right, but
Yeah.
I would think it's unreasonable to believe that there could have had that technology in post shortly after the war, late 40s,
Yeah.
early 50s. In other words, there would have to be some. You'd have to see the evolution of the development. for them to get there.
I'm talking about the accounts of the flying craft that are doing things that are basically impossible,
Yeah.
taking off at speeds, instantaneous high speed travel, that it's like there's no inertia or something, and or they're just moving space with them. Jeez.
Watchers posting hilarious pictures. Yeah. So, and the other thing, like Bosley has some good books on this, interesting books on breakaway civilization that started in the 1800s, where the technology started to begin being built in the 1800s. The NIMSA stuff. It's pretty good. You probably should you should get the books and check it out.
But if that was the case, why would we not have seen rocket technology mature until the 50s? They started using them in the 40s to a degree. We didn't really see them mature much until the 50s, and then
Yeah, I think in the NIMSA stuff, they never were using rockets. They didn't even go through that phase. I can't remember all the details, but it's really interesting stuff. But I don't know. The question always comes back to, what are these things we're seeing in the sky, right? And you saying like, well, it might be many things. Yeah, so the possibilities are military craft, very secret military craft, breakaway civilization stuff, single inventor things, like some crazy guy just built something awesome. At least that was, I mean, that was something that would happen in the past. You know, somebody would build a balloon and just go flying it somewhere. That I'm talking about centuries ago, and that would freak people out. How long have people been using balloons? That's not even really
Did
clear.
you guys see the news story where there was like a guy seen flying next to Air Force One? It was a guy. Yeah, they're like looking out the window and they're like, "That's a dude with a jetpack." He's like flying next to Air Force One. What's up?
What?
Yeah, you didn't see that?
No.
Yeah, it was like a couple of weeks ago or something,
You know,
maybe a month ago.
Wow.
like I said, some
And
of
they're
this.
thinking that it was that there's this company that makes these jetpack wings that you put on and
Right, those suits, they have a little, like a wingsuit, and it has little
it's
engines.
got a little
Yeah.
wing, and you're just in a suit, and you're.
It's not like the Lost in Space backpack. Right? That
No,
thing was
but
like,
I mean, it's a jetpack,
I think
but
it
it's a
only fly for
small
like
wing.
30 seconds or something.
And they drop them out of a plane. And
Oh.
then they take off, and then they parachute down when they're
Yeah.
done.
You know, it's possible that some of the things that are being observed are also not necessarily physical.
Yeah. Yeah.
They might be manifestations or perception of something that's in reality quite a bit different, and that's something we definitely will have to cover at some
Yeah,
point.
so that's
some information
going
on
through the list: military, breakaway civilization, single inventor, crazy guy, and then nuts and bolts, actual aliens, or consciousness-based something else, interdimensional, whatever you would call it. I don't even know if those are separate categories or not, or I guess interdimensional would be a separate category from consciousness. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know. But it starts to get fuzzy there. But yeah, there's a lot of possibilities, and maybe it's all of these things. The breakaway civilization idea is interesting. It's not really my go-to for it, though. But I don't really have one. I don't really know what to think about all of it. I still don't. I mean, we've done 3 shows on this now, and I've read tons of books about this subject, and I'm still just like, what the fuck is going on?
Yeah,
You know,
people
I
have been
no idea.
having this exact same conversation for nearly a century.
Yeah.
And maybe there are, it's not breakaway civilization, but a completely, separate civilization, living under the sea. How many
Yeah.
UFO reports
That's
do we
the other
hear about them
possibility.
going in and out of the oceans?
That's the other possibility is
You
it's
know?
just a whole other civilization that has been living here on Earth for forever. And they're either underground or underwater or both.
Or these mountain, like at the beginning when we started, about the reports about potential
mountain
mountain
base.
base.
Yeah.
We've heard those. These are recurring themes that
Yep. Doors opening in the sides of mountains and flying saucers coming out. Yep.
Right.
Yep. It is a recurring theme. I like that idea that it's, that we're not the most advanced civilization here.
Yeah, that's cool. And in that scenario, you could imagine an agreement with all the world powers.
Yeah.
Right.
That they would have to keep secret.
Right. And this other.
Otherwise,
How do you attack something that lives deep beneath the earth? What would you even do?
And this other civilization doesn't necessarily need to look any different than us either.
Yeah.
It's hard to say.
It could be us, just a previous version, people who went underground and survived the some previous cataclysm. I mean, there's this merges into the ancient aliens idea, but
yeah, and they would be, pale skinned and,
yep,
like,
because they live under the water.
yeah.
yeah, under the ground, under
They'd
the
be
water,
all,
yeah.
like huge eyeballs and stuff. Living in the dark.
Yep. All right. Well, that was a fantastic show, man. Well done.
All nuts. All
What-
day.
What about part 4? What do you got for part 4? What are you gonna do in that?
We'll get into perception and maybe some of these modern day sightings. Get into
All right.
some of the finer details of that hardware
Okay.
stuff.
Well, thanks so much for coming out, man. It's
Yeah,
always
buddy.
a blast.
Too much ground to cover. It's always fun though.
Well, good thing UFOs move really fast. All right, you guys know all the stuff, all the ending things. brothersandservant.com. Check us out.
Pyramids,
Pyramids,
schemes, and we love you.
yeah, always have.
Always will.
Good night, Adamu.
Get back to work.